Right. And last year, as you well know, what Governor Ritter did was to freeze property taxes. Well, what that means in districts where property taxes were scheduled to decrease, it raised their property taxes. That's a violation of the Constitution. So I think that this is a pattern in which they're basically saying, we know that the citizens of Colorado voted for tax and spending limits. We know we put them in the Constitution, but we don't think that the will of the people is appropriate here. So it is not an inconsequential change in the rules of the game. I think they basically, the end game here is to eliminate tax and spending limits. And in my view, I think it's unconstitutional. It creates all sorts of problems, legal problems, because clearly these are going to be challenged. So we don't know how the courts are going to rule on this, what the judicial interpretation is. That's going to create uncertainty for budgeting. And more importantly, it seems to me that basically it undermines the rule of law in Colorado. I think when citizens put tax and spending limits in the Constitution, they intend that those tax and spending limits should constrain government. And we've surveyed citizens, and citizens support these limits. Citizens support Tabor. And so in effect, I think that what these people are doing is saying, we don't care. We don't care about the rule of law, the initiative and referendum process. And as Josh says, in my view, if they are honest and if upfront, and there's a lot of talk about transparency and accountability, well, this is a perfect place to do it. Put it on the ballot, say we're going to change the Constitution.
There was a little more to this. I mean, the politics of this, the same people you're working with just a few years ago all said we can't change this without a vote of the people. Right. And then we've got thousands and thousands of lawyers with thousands and thousands of different opinions. One lawyer weighed in with just a few pages, and they're using that. What was the story there?
Well, it's lawyer shopping. I mean, the reality is that there are people, as Barry points out, that don't like Tabor, they don't like spending limits, and they're entitled to that view. In a free country, what they're not entitled to do is willy-nilly change it under their own terms and under their own procedures. But essentially what they did is went out and asked a prominent attorney, a former justice of the Supreme Court, to come up with an opinion. And her argument
is Jean Dubofsky, who is, by all accounts, a very smart lawyer who also is on the board of a group called the Fiscal Policy Institute, you know well, who is a group that sort of exists for the purpose of undoing Tabor and these spending limits. Again, their prerogative, but it's not without, that they're without biases going into this conversation. But essentially what Ms. Dubofsky's argument is that this is not a spending limit, even though if you go back to the original Bird-Arveschoug bill, it's referred to as a spending limit. When you go back and listen to the transcripts of the debate about it, time and time over, the proponents and opponents of the bill referred to it as a spending limit. What Ms. Dubofsky argues is that it's an allocation strategy for dollars. It's sort of this Orwellian rhetoric, sort of like a property tax increase that costs the taxpayers of the state hundreds of millions of dollars, the one that the governor instituted with the legislature 2 years ago. That's not a tax increase. A couple of things, and this gets into the politics of it.
Right.
Jean Dubofsky, who, by the way, we asked to be here. We asked her to come, and she declined, saying that she couldn't make it this time. And I'll just take that on face value, that she didn't want to, she couldn't make it, and it's not that she didn't want to talk about it. But she's on the board of an organization that pushes for more tax increases. Why do I have a feeling that on our board at the Independence Institute, if I had one of our lawyers who's on the board write up an opinion saying, no, this absolutely can't be, I have a feeling the majority party in the legislature wouldn't be running around saying, see, we've got the proof here, we can do this. What concerns me is there seems to be a growing habit among the legislature and the governor to bypass the people. Barry, you mentioned it several times. Let's go through this. In 2007, the governor signed what he called the Children's Amendment. Really what it was, it had nothing to do with children. It didn't mandate that any money get spent on children. It said that we'll raise property taxes. A lower court, thanks to a case that the Independence Institute put forward, found that unconstitutional. Just a couple weeks ago, you guys passed something called FASTER, which raises $250 million a year from increasing car taxes. They called them fees, but $250 million divided by the 5 million people here is what, $50 a man, woman, and child from now until forever, again without a vote of the people. And now this with Bird-Arveschoug, if they change those limits or change it again without a vote of the people, he'll be 3 for 3. I didn't know this was part of the Colorado Compromise. Let me go over here since you're the politician. I didn't know that Ritter that this was part of the Colorado Compromise. And if any of these are good ideas, why not do us a favor? Why not do us the decency of asking first? I always let gentlemen ask first.
Yeah, well, I think we know the answer. If you go back to last election that obviously Democrats did far better than I would like. But even in that cycle, there was a question about Tabor, essentially permanently debrucing, repealing the spending limits in ways that some are talking about in this General Assembly. And the voters overwhelmingly rejected that because, as Barry pointed out, and as you know well, and as the viewers know, Colorado prides itself in being a low-tax state. Us in New Hampshire, we're sort of endangered species anymore. But there's I think, a recognition by those who want to spend more, raise taxes, and grow government that a case to the voters will not succeed. And so it's a systematic effort underway to sort of skirt around the edges on major public policy questions. Let me give you one more example on that FASTER bill. Not only did it increase fees in the way that you described by $250 million, but they actually parked the money in an enterprise, in a government-run business, so that it doesn't count towards the Tabor spending limits. $250 million in new spending on roads and bridges, a so-called enterprise that doesn't count towards the Tabor limit. Again, it's a systematic effort to sidestep Tabor by people who don't like it.
Let me make one correction with you. You're right when you say Colorado is a low-tax state. I think the state government is a low-tax state, but we have 3,000 local governments, and when you take a look at local governments, we're in the top 10 of highest taxes there. So when you put it all together, I think we're in the top 15 of all 50 states of total tax burden.
When I said that, what I mean is I think voters have a diversion. You better have a solid case for a tax increase when you go to make one to the voters.
I think it's plainly obvious.
Yeah.
Ritter didn't go to the voters on the mill levy freeze because he would have been shot down. He certainly would have been shot down with this, according to the Democrats. They polled on it, and they said, well, if we call it a tax, we'll have to go to the voters, and it'll fail. Why do I have the same thing that's going to happen here? So why are they doing this? What is the end goal here? Because this means that with FASTER, they're going to get $250 million a year more to spend, hopefully, on roads. This would take away how much for roads?
More. And even in the short term, as soon as next year.
Yeah, essentially it's going to shift spending. This particular bill would shift spending from roads and highways and capital projects into general fund expenditures. Now, you and I know that the interest groups who would benefit most from this, of course, is the education lobby. And essentially the education lobby wants to see this because this will enable them to carve out an even more privileged position in the budget than they have at this point. And as Josh said, last fall they tried to do essentially the same thing with Amendment 59, and the citizens of Colorado voted overwhelmingly to defeat that. And I think that citizens in Colorado are finally figuring out that what the education lobby is doing is carving out this privileged position in the state budget. Amendment 23 says that the state must spend a constant increase in the growth of spending for education at inflation plus 1%. And then after 2010 at the rate of inflation. The education lobby, Amendment 23, required that the state earmark revenue for the Education Trust Fund. So this is simply one more attempt on the part of the education lobby to carve out this privileged position in the state budget. And I think people are finally saying, well, why should any special interest group have this privileged position? Every interest group should have to go in and defend their budget just like every other interest group, and there's no reason to carve out this privileged position.
Because if we leave it to them, they can't make those tough decisions, can you?
Well, I want to go back to this transportation point, because this is really a key one. Remember, the governor signed this bill a week ago last Monday.
This is the car, quote, fee bill, which is actually nothing more than a tax increase, about $50 per man, woman, and child.
$250 million out of the pockets of motorists, and it also gives lots of authority to toll existing roads and lots of other things. But this bill passes, and the governor argues we have a transportation fund in crisis. We need this fee. We need you to pay more, even though we're in dire economic times. He signs that at noon on Monday. Literally that same afternoon, we're debating this bill, which would take money out of transportation and put it into general programs. When you look at the math, as soon as next year, more money is taken under the bill that would repeal Arveschoug-Bird and these transportation funding bills than would be created under the governor's new car tax. It's actually a net loss for transportation.
All right,